Here, without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today's hearing is an opportunity to discuss an issue every household in America is familiar with the clear failure of Bidenomics and the crisis caused by this current administration's reckless spending. Joe Biden likes to say that Bidenomics is just another way of saying restoring the American dream. I beg to differ. But just last week, the Consumer Price Index showed prices have risen 17.4% since Mr. Biden took office. That means that 26 months of consumers watching their paychecks disappear before their very eyes due to the rising costs of living. Worse yet, mortgage rates have nearly doubled since Joe Biden took office, making it much harder for Americans to buy a new home. And that's clearly not the American dream. Joe Biden likes to say Bidenomics is about building from the middle out and the bottom up. That's a clever slogan, but it doesn't reflect reality. But those hurt by the rising prices are low. In fact, let me say this. Those hurt most by these rising prices are low-income households and seniors that are relying on Social Security for their monthly retirement. Wage growth has fallen behind the pace of inflation in 20 of the past 22 months. And most Americans are now unable to pay for the surprising expense of, if there's something that costs $400 suddenly, they're struggling to pay that bill, something that was unforeseen. And that's not building from the middle out or from the bottom up. Joe Biden likes to remind us he promised not to raise taxes on anyone earning less than $400,000 a year, but as of June 2023, the average worker was paying an inflation tax, kind of an invisible tax, because what inflation is a tax on everything that we need and have to buy, which is effectively, that 13.5% is effectively like a second federal income tax, particularly for low-income earners. The truth is, Bidenomics has been an abject disaster, and I think most of the American people know it. A recent poll found that 80%, let me say that again, 80% of Americans credit Joe Biden's policies for the current state of the economy, and 70% agreed that their incomes were not keeping pace with inflation. And if you see any poll in the last year and a half, 2 years, you've seen that the Biden administration scores, of all the major topics that we discuss, they score the worst on the economy. Our current economic track is nothing short of unsustainable, yet the Biden administration really doesn't seem to be concerned. In fact, Joe Biden considers the current environment a huge success, and he said that often on the campaign trail, proudly taking credit for every failed business that couldn't stay afloat under his crushing regulatory regime, or parents that are forced to pay bills with a credit card and then going into debt because their wages were not keeping up with inflation. According to Joe Biden, we're supposed to believe that we're actually better off today than we were when he took office, but the facts tell a very different story. The pain households are experiencing can be tied directly back to the disastrous policies pushed by this administration, which was so much reckless spending into the trillions of dollars. Now we're about to cap over $33 trillion in debt that our grandchildren and their grandchildren will have to pay. In the early days of COVID, emergency spending did make some sense. It clearly did. I wasn't in Congress at that time. I believe my colleague, my ranking member, wasn't either. But the country was thrown into a tailspin, and we had to ensure that our economy didn't capsize. However, this administration plowed forward, maintaining these quote-unquote wartime spending levels long after the spending was necessary, and really long after the pandemic was a national emergency any longer. It's been said, never let a good crisis go to waste, and they did not. From the American Rescue Plan to the Inflation Reduction Act, the administration has wasted no time throwing mind-boggling numbers at varying crises at their choosing with seemingly no regard for the consequences. The Biden administration apparently doesn't care if a gallon of milk costs $6. I know I do, or how much gasoline costs or an airline ticket, so long as it forces everyone to purchase an electric vehicle that costs more than the yearly median household income. Decades ago, Republicans banded together with the contract with America to bring about some of the most impactful economic reforms seen in generations. By combining a series of targeted, fiscally conservative policies into one unified agenda, House Republicans paved the way for Americans everywhere to prosper. We have already seen the blueprint for what works, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We should go ahead and achieve that kind of success again, or at least that should be our goal. We have also seen the blueprint for what doesn't work, and thanks to Bidenomics, we have an ugly reminder of what anti-growth policies bring. I want to thank our witnesses, all four of y'all, for being here today, and I look forward to a thoughtful discussion. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Bush for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. St. Louis and I are here today to discuss the real economic situation of the people of this country. From gas prices to food, the cost of living is rising. New census data indicates that real incomes fell significantly in 2022 as inflation reduced the size of our constituents' paychecks. We know there are investments that the federal government can make to reduce poverty. The Republican Party's inability to govern has us rapidly moving toward a total government shutdown. This will disrupt important benefits and services for all of our constituents, such as food and cash assistance. Too many people around this country, across this country, are struggling to make ends meet. A government shutdown would affect more than 42 million people who receive SNAP benefits, nearly 3 million people who receive TANF benefits, and over 6 million participants who receive WIC benefits. Congress pulled together in a crisis to provide COVID relief, this emergency relief that people needed. My vision of a progressive economy led by the Biden administration must include Medicare for all, must include raising the federal minimum wage, ensuring housing affordability, reinstating the child tax credit, and canceling student debt. That's my vision. During the pandemic, we made direct payments to families through the child tax credit and provided student debt relief by freezing interest and payments. We still need to do more now. These two concrete examples show Congress can ease the effects of economic hardship and boost the economy overall. When it was in place, the child tax credit lifted nearly 4 million children from poverty, causing child poverty to hit a historic low of 5.2%. The expanded child tax credit slashed child poverty, infused local economies with billions of dollars, and reduced food insecurity by nearly 1/3. In Missouri alone, the child tax credit lifted 73,000 children out of poverty. Without the child tax credit, child poverty in the United States has more than doubled in just 1 year. Since its expiration, nearly 3.7 million children have fallen back into poverty, including the impacted children of Missouri. Millions of people in this country are buried in burdensome debt to make ends meet. Medical, credit card, and student debt. Student debt payments will resume soon after numerous payment pauses extended by the Biden administration. Though that temporary relief has helped many, we need much more, and we must cancel student debt. The federal student loan portfolio currently totals more than $2 trillion, owed by over 40 million borrowers. Black people carry the heaviest debt burden, meaning student debt, say it again, student debt relief is a racial and an economic justice issue. As lawmakers, we must ensure education leads to prosperity, education leads to opportunity, rather than inescapable debt. While my Republican colleagues are slashing programs that help keep kids out of poverty and fighting against student debt relief every step of the way, we have an over $880 billion defense package moving forward. The money is there. The question is how we as elected officials choose to invest in our communities. The money is there. We can deliver for our constituents and help them out to not only survive, but to prosper. Republicans are trying to distract us from the internal dysfunction which is steering our nation toward a government shutdown. The question is, do we choose to invest in defense contractors or reduce poverty for millions of people? Thank you, and I yield back.
We have with us today an expert panel of witnesses who each bring valuable experiences and policy insights that will be beneficial to our discussion. First, we have Carrie Sheffield, who is a senior policy analyst for the Independent Women's Forum. She previously managed municipal credit risk at Goldman Sachs and rated healthcare bonds at Moody's Investor Service. We also have it's Antoni, right? Okay. I get nervous when I see vowels. My mother's maiden name's Genovese. I want to get it right, okay? Mr. Antoni serves as a research fellow for the Heritage Foundation's Grover H. Hermann Center for the Federal Budget and as a senior fellow at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. He focuses his work primarily on fiscal and monetary policy. Casey Mulligan serves as a professor of economics at the University of Chicago and previously served as a chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors under the Trump administration. And finally, we have Kogan? Okay, Bobby Kogan, who serves as a senior policy director of federal budget policy at the Center for American Progress. I'm a member of Congress from Texas, but I grew up in Massachusetts, so I will quote a Boston term, you're all wicked smart. Thank you again for being here. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony that you're about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please sit. We appreciate you being here and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and it will appear in the full hearing record. Please limit your statements to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you. I believe it says talk, and so that the members will be able to hear you. When you do speak, the light in front of you will be turning green. For 4 minutes it'll be green, 1 minute will be yellow, and then it'll be red, and that's when your 5 minutes are up. And if you're at that red, if you could just wrap it up, that would be great. I now recognize Ms. Sheffield for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Fallon. Thank you, Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Bush, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today. As has been said, my name is Carrie Sheffield, and I am a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic Opportunity at Independent Women's Forum. We are a nonprofit organization committed to increasing the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty. We advance policies that enhance people's freedom, opportunities, and well-being. My work focuses on expanding economic opportunities for women. We are here to discuss Bidenomics, a perfect storm of spending, debt, and inflation. And indeed, this storm is already hammering suffering communities and homes nationwide. Evidence shows that President Biden's signature legislative packages, such as the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act, contributed to persistent inflation and are failing to bring it back down more sustainably. This increased government spending triggered more inflation, eroding wages, and increased government spending and buying power. The White House has talked about an uptick in nominal wages, but as research from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis shows, real wages have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, even as they are starting to rise nominally. Families are stretching their dollars further each day since their paychecks and retirement funds are worth far less than when they were when President Biden took office. CNBC reported this year that an alarming 54% of the American public reported using savings to pay for everyday expenses such as groceries and rent. Savings are down, as is economic confidence. The recent multi-trillion-dollar increases in government spending erode the value of the dollar through inflation because the money is expanding demand and driving prices up. CBO projects the federal budget deficit in 2023 is $34 billion more than the deficit recorded last year. That increase would be larger if not for a shift in the timing of certain payments and the spending cuts that were forced by House Republican leadership this past April in a sustainable manner. Fraudulent actors may have also stolen some $1 out of every 7 in pandemic unemployment, totaling as much as $135 billion, according to a new GAO report. That means that scammers made off with between 11 and 15% of the increased jobless benefits that Congress approved on a bipartisan basis early in the coronavirus crisis. This tragic waste of taxpayer money is stealing from American families, who are now more than $1 trillion in credit card debt, a historic high hit last month. That is Bidenomics in action. Regarding America's ticking debt bomb, the Wall Street Journal notes that the Congressional Budget Office regularly updates its long-term budget forecasts and says that U.S. debt held by the public will surpass gross domestic product this fiscal year, and that interest on the debt will equal about 3/4 of discretionary non-defense spending. By 2031, it will be as large. Medicare, Social Security, and of course interest are legally non-negotiable. Military spending isn't really optional either. It's no wonder that the federal government is described as an insurance company with an army. These unsustainable public debt interest payments will crowd out important public expenditures for other discretionary needs. Congress must act now to cut spending in order to rein in these unsustainable debt and interest levels. Increased upward pressure on U.S. interest rates we are experiencing now will add additional pressure to businesses and the real estate market, which has experienced a significant constriction under Bidenomics. The civilian labor force participation rate remains below pre-pandemic levels under Bidenomics. It is currently at 62.8% in August 2023, compared to 63.3% in February 2020. The Consumer Price Index stood at 3.67% on August 1st, which is a steep drop below the inflation of 9.1% last summer. But it is still above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, and more importantly, a sharper measure of inflation is the median consumer price index, or median CPI. That measure was 5.72% at August 1, 2023, significantly higher than the standard CPI. That is why the headlines are, even though they sound rosier, the median CPI shows that families are actually still suffering significantly because of Bidenomics and inflation. While Bidenomics may define inflation as a high-class problem, as Ron Klain, the former chief of staff for Joe Biden, said in the White House, most Americans disagree. The median CPI helps explain why, in a recent CNN poll, 66% of Americans disapprove of how Biden has handled the economy, with 76% describing the economy as in poor shape. Congress can act to help slow the ill effects of Bidenomics through a return to the economic principles that built America's extraordinary economic engine: fiscal prudence, competition, and regulation that enhances rather than undermines fair competition and growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Antoni for his opening remarks.
Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Bush, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to discuss with you today the impact of federal spending, debt, and inflation on the American people and various aspects of our economy as well. I'm a public finance economist at the Heritage Foundation, where I research fiscal and monetary policy with a particular focus on the Federal Reserve, and I'm also a fellow at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. The last 3 years of public policy have been characterized most notably by excessive government spending, inflation, and anemic economic growth. Despite periods of near record high federal revenues by multiple measurements, we have seen deficits of $2.7 trillion, $1.4 trillion, and $1.6 trillion in fiscal years 2021, 2022, and 2023, respectively, with the last month of 2023 being estimated, and with the deficit for fiscal year 2024 projected to be $1.9 trillion, yet another increase. Massive borrowing by the Treasury and monetary financing of deficits by the Federal Reserve created 40-year high inflation and imposed a hidden but heavy tax on the American people. Inflation transfers wealth from the people to the government, and frankly, there is no better definition of a tax than that. It is worth pausing for a moment as well to emphasize that it is the government and only the government which can create inflation, because it is only the government that has control over the money supply. A lot of scapegoats are thrown around for inflation, such as greedy businesses or spendthrift consumers, or grasping unions trying to get higher wages, whatever the case may be. These are all tropes that were dragged out in the 1970s, and they are just as untrue today as they were then. As just one example, prices paid by businesses have actually increased faster under President Joe Biden than prices paid by consumers. If businesses are being greedy, they are certainly doing it wrong. Prices on average for consumers have increased 16.6% since President Joe Biden took office, and wages have not kept up with inflation. Real, meaning inflation adjusted, weekly earnings are down 4.7%. For the typical American family with two parents working and earning that average weekly pay, this has been a loss in annual purchasing power of over $5,100. Shockingly, the average American worker now loses more through the hidden tax of inflation on his hourly wages than he pays in federal income tax. Similarly, household net worth has increased about $23 trillion during Mr. Biden's tenure, but nearly all of that is just inflation. Almost all the household net worth generated over the last 2.5 years has effectively been transferred to the government through inflation. And while headline inflation has come down since June 2022, things are not improving for many Americans. Inflation has actually reaccelerated the last 2 months, and the monthly change in real earnings was negative in both July and August. In terms of annual change, things have been even worse under Mr. Biden. Annual weekly earnings growth has lagged inflation for all but the first 2 months and the last 3 months of Mr. Biden's presidency to date. The 26 months in between are a record for consecutive annual declines in real earnings growth. As interest rates rise in the wake of 40-year high inflation, borrowing costs have risen for businesses, consumers, and the Treasury, creating an unsustainable problem for the United States Treasury and the current trajectory of both the deficit and the debt. In terms of the American family, I estimate that for the typical American family, they are paying an additional $1,800 a year now in higher financing costs compared to January of 2021. Coupled with the decline in real earnings, this leaves a family roughly $7,000 poorer than when Biden took office. However, it should be emphasized that many Americans are even worse off than that. For those trying to buy a home today, the monthly mortgage payment on a median priced home has risen over $1,000 during that time. And so it costs a family about $13,000 more per year, every year, over the life of a 30-year mortgage. These are just a few examples of how Bidenomics, excessive government spending, borrowing, and creation of money has inflicted a tremendous amount of financial pain on the American people.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Professor Mulligan for his opening statement.
Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Bush, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you how federal policy is affecting the economy, workers, and consumers. Under the Biden administration's policy agenda, high inflation has emerged as a hidden and bothersome tax. Regulatory costs add another layer of hidden taxation, especially burdening small businesses and low-income households. The labor market has been affected by this agenda, with real wages falling below pre-pandemic trends. According to the CBO, the federal debt held by the public is already 98% of a year's GDP and would almost double to 181% by 2053 under current law. This is driven by federal spending. Government spending has to be paid for, either with taxes narrowly defined, such as income taxes or taxes in the future, or the inflation tax. For example, the recent inflation surge translated to a $2.2 trillion unanticipated tax on debt holders, administered in less than 3 years as the purchasing power of their assets was eroded. A recent econometric study concludes that the recent and previously unanticipated fiscal expansion in the U.S. and other OECD countries is likely a key driver of inflation in 2020 through 2022. Even without new tax legislation, inflation increases marginal tax rates on businesses and personal incomes, deterring business investment and reducing real wages. Beyond taxes, many regulations make workers less productive and thereby reduce the wages that they can earn. Others make consumer products such as prescription drugs, automobiles, and internet service more expensive. The rules finalized by the Biden administration through the end of 2022 impose costs of nearly $10,000 per household. That's new. Of course, we had regulations before that, which is $1,300 more than the new regulations that the Obama administration had created during the comparable time frame. If the 2021-22 regulatory pace accelerates, as it did in the Obama years, costs would near $60,000 per household after 8 years of rulemaking. President Trump's pace was in the opposite direction, saving the average household $80,000 compared to what the Biden administration is doing. The $80,000 in regulatory costs far exceeds, for example, the revenue provisions of the Build Back Better Act, which would have cost only in Washington, could I use that phrase, $14,000 per household if it had passed. For the purposes of understanding economic consequences, the Biden agenda fits into two categories. One category would be redistributive policies that reduce employment, and the second category would be policies that reduce productivity and real wages. Redistributive policies distort the economy twice. First, as the revenue is raised, households and businesses change their behavior to alleviate the burden. Often this involves less investment in business capital, less investment in human capital, and less work. Other times, investment and work are redirected to less productive uses. Second, economic distortions are created as the revenue is dispersed. Particularly regarding safety net programs, households and businesses change their behavior to become eligible for the program or increase the benefit received. A good projection of the combined effect of the Biden spending, regulatory, and tax agenda is to reduce labor income that workers get by 5 to 6.5%. Unsurprisingly, the labor market is in fact falling short. Real employee compensation per adult was already 3.3% below trend below the pre-pandemic trend as of the end of 2022. Small businesses are especially burdened by taxes and regulations. New federal regulations are regressive, meaning they proportionally hit lower income households more than high income households, especially because many rules from health insurance to telecommunications to environment are in effect forcing middle and lower class families to have champagne tastes on a beer budget. Several policy options can reduce tax, data, and/or regulatory burdens. Regarding safety net programs, eligibility and benefit rules could return to, say, what they were in 2008, when we had a safety net, but not as large as it is now. Even though the latest poverty rate is 15% below what it was in 2008, the fraction of the population participating in Medicaid has increased more than 70%. Poverty goes down, but government program participation up. SNAP participation far exceeds the number of households in poverty. Safety net program integrity has also dramatically eroded. I'm not sure there's much left, with hundreds of billions of dollars spent that should not have been spent under the law. Federal health care programs can be reformed to require less revenue while providing greater value to patients. More specifics are provided in my written testimony on the Trump administration's Choice and Competition report. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kogan for his opening remark.
Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Bush, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. Today, I intend to make 2 points. First, the investments in the last 3.5 years were appropriately sized and led to the strongest economic recovery in my lifetime. And second, the cuts proposed by the House Appropriations Committee Republicans would harm America by underfunding critical programs. In response to a once-in-a-century pandemic, American demand plummeted, leaving the economy at its most vulnerable state since the Great Depression. The prime age employment to population ratio, or EPOP, dropped 10 percentage points in 2 months. And even when the economy largely reopened, prime age EPOP still stood roughly as low as the trough of the Great Recession. But rather than taking 10 years to recover, our economy did so in under 2 years. Our rapid recovery was possible only because of significant investment into the economy and the American people. The Biden administration built upon the previous COVID bills to provide relief and ensure the American economy was able to invest in the future. The American Rescue Plan expanded on many of the earlier critical programs. It was intended both to ensure households could weather a difficult economy and to ensure that the economy that we rebuilt would be better and more resilient. Through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration made significant investments in the future. The result has been large progress. Among G7 nations, the United States has had the strongest pandemic recovery. And incredibly, U.S. real GDP has roughly returned to where CBO projected it would be before the pandemic even happened, as if COVID and the ensuing recession had never happened. Our historic recovery has also led to the strongest job market in U.S. history. Adjusting for demographics, the employment to population ratio is at its highest level in history, and black prime age EPOP is hovering around its historic high, with a historically small gap between black and white prime age employment. This strong job market has benefited the American people. Real average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory employees have matched their pre-pandemic trend, also as if the pandemic had never happened, and gains have been particularly strong among lower wage workers. Importantly, that has happened because inflation has come down. The United States also has the lowest core harmonized inflation among G7 countries. Further, the path in recent months is encouraging. Core CPI has been trending down since the spring of 2021, with a 3-month annualized average down to 2.4%. And even better, the contribution of housing rents to CPI inflation, which rose due to longstanding supply shortages in the U.S., meeting pandemic shifts in demand, is cooling and approaching pre-pandemic levels. While inflation rose to uncomfortable levels as the economy largely reopened, this was not caused by excessive stimulus. CBO estimates potential GDP, which measures how much the economy can produce without creating excessive inflation. And it believes that GDP ran barely above potential for only 1 quarter, and that the economy otherwise has run slightly below potential. In other words, our COVID response was appropriately sized. Instead, a global pandemic broke supply chains and caused monumental shifts in demand. It is impossible for inflation to not rise some in the presence of supply chain issues and massive shifts in demand. But as supply chain issues subsided and companies shifted their supply and production to match new habits and demand, inflation has come down. This progress is being threatened now by the work of the House Appropriations Committee majority. Despite rhetoric to the contrary, non-defense discretionary funding excluding VA medical care, or NDD STAR, shrank as a percent of GDP in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. Despite this, House Republican appropriators wrote levels $58 billion below the debt limit deal, which would leave NDD STAR at its lowest level on record going back more than 60 years. Even worse, the cuts proposed to achieve this low level of funding are extreme. To highlight just 3, Title I education grants would be cut by nearly 80%. Money that ensures our drinking water is safe would be cut by 59%, and nutrition assistance for newborns and pregnant moms would also be cut. These cuts would harm the American people. Even worse, they seem to be the asking price for not forcing a government shutdown. Immediately during a government shutdown, some children with cancer would be denied treatment at NIH facilities, and some of our food would go without its health and safety inspections. The government is supposed to work for the American people, and neither cutting programs that people rely on nor shutting down the government serves that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to recess for votes, and the committee will return 10 minutes after the close of the final vote. Thank you very much, and we'll be right back.